Hi everyone, Karina here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the breath. And I'm so delighted to share this with you because I think if there's one thing, if I could only teach one thing, it would be breath. Because it has so much power to radically shift the way that we feel, to shift our state in such a short amount of time. We can just take a single breath or 3 breaths and notice a powerful change in our body, in our mind. Our breath is like the doorway between our mind body. And by changing something about our physicality, our physiology, changing the way that we're breathing, we can change the way that we think and the way that we feel. And that's really powerful. There's a lot of benefit that's available there. So I think of the breath as, well, as many things. But one way that I think about the breath is that it's a way that we can speak directly to our nervous system. We can adopt a way of breathing that has a specific result in mind, that can create a certain state. We can mimic certain nervous system states through our breath. And we can use breath to activate and energize us. We can also use breath to downregulate and slow us down, help us relax. So most of the breaths that we will all teach will probably be those calming, soothing, downregulating breaths. And if you explore more breath work, you might get into some of those more activating breaths, things like Wim Hof and a lot of Pranayama, like breath of fire, can be really activating. So let's do a short breath practice before we dive into information, and let's just explore our breath together, because the best way to become a really good teacher is to have personal experience with what you are sharing. You really can't teach mindfulness or yoga without knowing how it feels in your own body and how it impacts your experience in a moment and over a length of time. So go ahead and get yourself cozy, settled in. You probably want to sit or stand for this. You want to be upright in some way. You might like to close your eyes or just let your gaze settle somewhere in the room. And begin to notice your breathing. You don't have to change it in any way. You're just noticing that you are, in fact, breathing. And if judgments arise about your breath, which is so normal, thinking that our breath is to this or to that, not enough of this, that's perfectly okay. See if you can allow that to just kind of flow right out of your awareness, those judgments, and bring yourself back to the knowing, the trust that your body is breathing exactly how it needs to in every moment. However you are breathing is a perfect reflection of the state of your nervous system. And as you spend more time with your awareness in your breath will change. It changes by being observed, just like anything in the universe. So notice the sound of your breath. It may be a very subtle sound, but there is a sound. Notice if you can feel air flowing in past your nostrils or your lips. feeling your breath flowing into your body and then flowing out of your body. Notice if your breath feels more fast or more slow than usual, or does it feel pretty normal? Notice the depth of your breath. Does it feel full and deep? Does it feel kind of shallow, stuck, short? Perhaps it feels freely flowing in some parts of your breath and then a little stagnant or blocked in other parts of your breath. And again, whatever you find is perfect. Now you can let all of that noticing go and shift your attention into the part or parts of your body that move as you breathe. If it feels helpful to connect to it, you can place your hand on those parts and breathe into your hands, feeling your body expanding and contracting with each breath. When you're ready, you can let your hands settle. Maybe take one really full cleansing breath, letting out a sigh as you breathe out. If your eyes are closed, letting them gently open. Maybe taking a look around your space, down at your body, and taking a moment to notice how you feel. Maybe you've noticed a very subtle change in the way you feel now from the way that you felt when you first pressed play on this video. Or maybe there's a very noticeable, clear change. But there's probably something within yourself that you notice. And this is part of the power of breath. And the more we practice, the more we try on different techniques of breathing, the more intimate we become with our own breath and perhaps more importantly, how we feel about our own breath. There are different components to our breathing. In each breath cycle, you have an inhale, and then you have this little space at the top of your inhale. You haven't exhaled yet. There's just this little hover point, and maybe it feels like a pause, like a still point, or maybe it's just part of this flowing transition you're moving through. So you inhale, there's a space, and then you exhale, and there's another space between your exhale and your next inhale. So we can really break down and stretch out and expand each part of our breath in order to explore them, to create a different state, and different things happen with each of those. For example, when you lengthen your exhale, it increases the length of time that your heart receives a signal to slow down. That happens every time you exhale. Your heart gets this signal saying, slow down a little bit. And so then if we lengthen the exhale, our heart is getting that signal more and more and more. So one breathing technique that can be helpful for people, some people, not all, is to take a normal breath in and then to lengthen their exhale by just 1 or 2 counts. And it can start to have this really beautiful effect. Now, one thing that we have to consider as we are guiding people through their breath is that our breath is, while it has this incredible healing, shifting, transformative power, the flip side of that power is that it is so intimately tied to our life force. It is the river of life that runs through us, you could say. If you stop breathing, you stop living. And while we're never going to instruct someone to stop breathing, something like holding the breath or holding the breath out, lengthening the space between your exhale and your inhale, can be really deeply unsettling for some people, for a lot of people. And that is true for every and any part of the breath. And I won't go too much into it right now. This is something to explore a little more in our discussion and in your own research. But when we are breathing with people, we want to provide a lot of options, a lot of choice, because the breath is so individual, it's so personal, and it's so, it can be both transformative and triggering. And so we want to remind people that they have full agency over their experience. They have full choice of whether they try on a breath or not, that they know that they can kind of dip their toe into the water and step back if they're not into it, or they can just stand on the shore and wait for everyone to be done swimming. Or there's a lot of other options there too. I encourage you to, in your breathing, whether it is a simple breath awareness like we did together at the beginning, or if it's trying on certain breathing techniques, either from Pranayama in the yogic tradition or from Breathwork, which comes from many different sources, that you really get to know those spaces for yourself. When you come to a place where you're like, oh, this is uncomfortable, I don't really want to go here, that you remember that and you notice that. You kind of bank that in your vocabulary of different experiences that can be had when exploring conscious breathing. And the same goes for noticing and remembering the really beautiful experiences, because practicing conscious breathing can be a deeply spiritual experience. It can be a deeply emotional experience. It can be liberating. It can be grounding. It can be energizing and joyful. We really can create any kind of state we want through the breath. So we'll do a few different breaths together. But before we go into a little more breath practice and close out, I want to talk a little bit about biomechanics and anatomy, because this is something we can play with as well, right? When you're guiding breath, you don't have to use breathing techniques that you've learned from somewhere else. You can create your own. And there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that you generally want your exhales to be of equal length or longer than your inhales, because when we have a longer inhale, we can hyperoxygenate the body, and that oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, all of the stuff that we are breathing in and out, that gets thrown off balance. And you'll know when that happens because you'll start to get dizzy and lightheaded. Now, here's the nuance, because there's so much nuance in breathing. There are certain breathing techniques like Wim Hof where hyperoxygenation is an intentional result of that way of breathing. I don't recommend leading it unless you know it really well or you've been trained in it. But pretty much other than that, you can kind of mix and match and create and make all of these beautiful breaths for yourself and your students. what was I about to say? I lost my train of thought. There was something before. Oh, okay. So I remember. So when we're looking to guide people through breath, we don't just have to choose a breathing technique that we've learned from somewhere else. We can create our own. And we can refer to our vocabulary of components of breath. So we have all of the ways that we can sense our breath, and we explored a few of those, right? We listened to the sound of our breath. We noticed where it was entering our body and the sensation of that. Same with leaving your body. So there's what was the first thing I said? I heard my son in the other room and got a little distracted. So there's the way that our breath sounds. There's the way that our breath feels as it enters or leaves our body. There's the way that our breath feels inside of our body, right? Constricted, free-flowing, stagnant, blocked, liberating, expansive. There's feeling the sensation of our body moving with our breath. There's feeling your breath flowing down your throat, filling up your lungs, maybe filling all the way up to the bottoms of your toes. So we can really go very far in any direction, and you can guide your students and yourself through breath by just choosing one of those and really diving in and exploring all of these little qualities that we can notice. So we can notice through our senses, smell, touch, all of these things. We can notice the different parts of the breath cycle, inhale, space, exhale, space. We can also bring awareness to the different parts of our body that we breathe into. So when we breathe in, we're drawing air into our lungs, down our throat. And when that happens, our lungs expand, they inflate to fill with air. In order for them to have room to inflate, something in our torso has to move out of the way. And we have three options with that. Our belly can move out and create this space underneath the lungs into the diaphragm for taking a breath. They can fill up through the bottom. We can expand out the ribs and chest, and so then our lungs move out. We can also expand up into the shoulders. The lungs move up. And they're really moving in all directions for all of these breaths, but the most noticeable direction are the ones that I mentioned for each of those places. And so something that we hear a lot in different styles of teaching are preferences for breathing into certain parts of the body. In yoga, it's the belly. It's all about the belly breath. And there's reasons for that. In biomechanics and more physiologically informed practices, biomechanically informed practices, it's all about rib breathing. And then if you get into different types of breath work, especially that are designed for trauma healing, there's a lot in the shoulders. So we can also breathe into all of these centers in one breath. So let's dive very briefly. I won't go too far into it because this is something that I'm really passionate about and I love exploring in my own breathing practice and talking to other teachers about. So I can get carried away. I made this video last night and it literally what was supposed to be like a 20-25 minute video ended up being an hour. So I'm remaking it now. So really briefly, when we breathe into the belly, the lungs fill up mostly from the bottom. And when that happens, we have our diaphragm underneath our lungs. It sits right underneath the bottom or right above the bottom of the rib cage. So you can feel your diaphragm. Take your fingers, your fingertips, and you're going to feel for your bottom ribs. And you're going to press your fingers into the bottom of your rib cage, and you're going to cough. Feel how your fingers shoot out. Happens when you laugh too. Right? So that is your diaphragm moving with your breath, right? You're exhaling, it contracts. So when we breathe in through our belly, we have this space underneath our lungs. Our lungs can fill from the bottom. It presses our diaphragm down. It inflates the belly, and you'll also see that it kind of inflates everywhere. You can breathe into your low back and your sides. And so for a lot of people, this is the way that they can take their fullest breath. Now, this is why it is taught so much, or one of the reasons why there's such a heavy focus in a lot of traditions on belly breathing. Now, the thing that we have to consider is that some would say, biomechanists would say that is not how we are actually designed to breathe. If you look at little kids, you see that they breathe into their belly. And the reason for that is that their abdominal muscles aren't fully developed yet. You'll see once kids start to get around 5, 6, 7, they tend to get these very strong abs and they start to breathe into their ribs. So we'll go into rib breathing in just a minute, but I want to mention why we may not want to offer belly breathing for certain populations. So that downward force that happens when the diaphragm moves down and the belly inflates can create intra-abdominal pressure inside the abdomen. It also presses down on the pelvic floor. So if you are teaching to pregnant women, mothers, anybody who could have a pelvic floor issue, which is a very large amount of people, anybody who may have an undiagnosed abdominal injury, very high amount of people, then we don't want to put more pressure on the connective tissue of their abdomen and on their pelvic floor, because it's going to make those issues worse. So what are our other options? We can breathe into our ribs. So the reason that we don't do this a lot, the reason that we don't naturally breathe into our ribs when it's said by biomechanists who study the way that our body functions, the way it's designed to, what happens when we are not living in a way that really supports the natural function of our body. Because we don't live in a way where we are stretching these muscles, the muscles that connect each of your ribs together are called your intercostals. You have a layer on the outside of your ribs and a layer on the inside of your ribs. If you've ever eaten like pork ribs, beef ribs, you're eating intercostal muscles. So if you place your hands on the sides of your ribs, underneath your armpits, fingertips can point up or maybe forward, and you take a breath into your hands, and at the same time you press your hands into your ribs. So it's like this, your rib cage is moving out, your hands are moving in, but you're still taking a breath in. You'll feel your ribs press into your hands. Keep that same pressure, pressing your hands onto your ribs, and exhale. We'll do that 2 more times, breathing in, breathing out. Breathe in and let it go. So you might notice a little bit of a different feeling. Maybe it feels like you can take a fuller breath into your ribs, or maybe it feels like, whoa, that is so not the place for me to take a full breath right now. When we apply pressure on those muscles, which we can do with our hands or by tying a yoga strap or a scarf around our ribs. You can tie a scarf and do even like a whole yoga practice like that. By the time you take it off, you will have the fullest, most amazing breath. It's incredible. Highly recommend it. But so what happens when we breathe into the ribs is that those intercostal muscles, they stretch and they allow the ribs to flare out. So the ribs are these kind of like oblong, I'm trying to find something that shape. They're not a perfect circle. It's not a perfect cylinder. They're sort of oblong like that. And so they're up and down, right? You've got all your ribs kind of stacked on top of each other. And when you breathe into your ribs, they kind of flare out to the side. They all kind of go like this. And you can watch that. If you look at yourself in the mirror, especially if you do it without a shirt on, you can really see your body moving. There is this flaring kind of motion that happens. And if you look at the shape of your rib cage and then the shape of your lungs inside your rib cage, your ribs are like a perfect frame for your lungs. So the reason that we don't naturally breathe here in our culture right now is because we keep our arms by our sides like 90+% of the time. If you think about human origins and how we lived when we had to do all of the work for all of our food and our shelter and child rearing and everything about our way of life, we probably had a lot of these like reaching up movements, right? We were picking fruit, we were leaning over to grab something, maybe we were swinging from trees and vines, we were carrying water and jugs of things on our heads, we're reaching up to hold them there, we're putting little ones on our shoulders, on our back, we're tying babies on our back. You get the idea. We had all of these reasons to be doing these movements, side stretches, reaching up, twisting, all of these things that keep these intercostal muscles really mobile and supple. So because we're like this with our arms by our sides much of the time, we just have lost that mobility, but we can always get it back. So if this is something that you're curious to explore and see how you can expand your breathing capacity into your ribs, especially if you're a mother, especially if you have abdominal issues or pelvic floor issues, I highly recommend exploring this for yourself and doing it by simply breathing into your ribs while you apply pressure. It's really lovely. So we're almost at time, but I want to talk a little bit about shoulder breathing because this is one that I am a natural shoulder breather. I naturally breathe up into my shoulders. And through my journey of breathwork and pranayama, if you are someone who breathes into their shoulders, you can get the message a lot of like, you're doing it wrong or you're not breathing correctly. There's no way to breathe incorrectly, by the way. So yes, this is a shallower breath, generally speaking, breathing into your shoulders. The cavity, the capacity for expansion when you inhale is not as great as your ribs or your belly. Now, that is very individual. Some of us may have a lot of tightness in our belly and our ribs, but then we've got all this mobility up here. Another reason why we might want to breathe up in here, aside from just having the most capacity on an individual basis, is that if you are someone that tends toward flight mode when you become dysregulated, you tend to have anxiety, you get overwhelmed, scattered, you want to avoid, you turn away from stress, then you probably naturally breathe into your shoulders. And if you're someone that has panic attacks and you go into a flight breath, which is a quick gasp in through your shoulders, then having a conscious, slow breath into your shoulders can be so soothing and empowering. It can be a really beautiful breath for those who tend toward flight, which is those who tend toward anxiety, to explore shoulder breathing. So in addition to noticing the different ways we can perceive our breath, the sound, the sensation, noticing the different parts of our breath, we can also breathe into different places in our body. So let's go ahead and do 2 breaths together. One is called coming home breath. We'll breathe into different parts of our body and then all of them together, and then we'll do one final breath. So let's start by placing our hands on our belly, and we're just going to take a single breath into each part. So hands on your belly, take a full breath in, let your belly expand out into your hands. And then as you breathe out, let your hands follow as your belly gently moves back toward your spine. Now bring your hands onto the sides of your ribs and breathe in. Breathe out. Hands on your shoulders, breathing in. Breathing out. And now, see what it feels like to breathe first into your belly then your ribs, then your shoulders. And then out from your shoulders, then your belly. Then your ribs, then your belly. So now we only did one breath in each of these locations and in the multiple locations breath. But I really encourage you to explore this a little bit and practice, 10 breaths in each location. Notice how it feels for you physically. How full of a breath can you take? How good or not good does it feel? How does it feel emotionally for you? And I would have done it more, but I just want to be considerate of time. So let's do our final breath together, which is integration breath. This is one of my favorites for helping people get into a bit of a flow state, and it can be really, really helpful for anxiety, for calming the mind, and getting into the body. So for integration breath, we can sit or stand, and we have our hands palm up in front of us. And as we breathe in, we lift our hands up toward the sky. And they can just rise an inch or two, or we can extend them all the way up. But breathing in, lifting the hands up. And then when we're ready to exhale, we turn the hands over, palms face down, float the hands down. So let's do 3 breaths just like that. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. Last one, breathing in and let it go. I am so delighted that we got to do this, that we got to share this together, and I know that you sharing breath with your students, with your friends, with people you love and care about, with your children, and exploring breath yourself more deeply is such a beautiful gift to yourself and to the world and to all those that you share it with. It is one of the most transformative practices out there, and there's so much to be explored here. We're just touching on a tiny little bit, so thank you. Thank you for being on this journey for yourself, for sharing it with the world, and for exploring curiously with an open mind and an eager heart. Have a beautiful day.